So, with the need for cheap labor for agribusiness, especially after the 1924 Immigration Act, you see agribusiness owners looking to the Philippines as a source of new cheap labor. And if we look at demographically who the Manongs were, who comprised the Manongs? Well, demographically, most of them were very young. In fact, statistically speaking, 85% were under the age of 35. Most were unmarried bachelors. 77% of the Manongs that came during the 20s and 30s were unmarried. And of course, they're overwhelmingly male. 93% of the Manongs that would find themselves in the U.S. West were men. So, in fact, the ratio between the genders was 14-1 during the 1920s. 14-1. 14 men to every 1 woman. And this is going to be important to recognize because, as we'll see, it's going to factor in the rise of anti-Filipino sentiment, especially by the early 1930s. Okay, now it deserves mention here that agricultural jobs were mostly seen as unattractive to the typical American worker. So with the 1924 Immigration Act, you no longer have a supply of, or a large supply of immigrant labor. And then the American worker sees agricultural work as unattractive. And therefore, agribusiness owners felt that the Filipinos are the perfect race for this, especially because of their smaller stature. They felt that they're naturally disposed towards what they called steep labor, which, if you look at this picture, they're all stooped over like this, right? And because they're shorter, right, it was felt that they were more naturally inclined, physically inclined towards this type of work. Another reason why most Americans did not like this work is simply because how hard it was. You add that with the climate, the work conditions, and the low pay. Even today, most of us would prefer not to do this type of work. We'd probably prefer to work in an air-conditioned retail store rather than this stuff, right? Now, similar to past Asian laborers that came, the Chinese and Japanese, the Filipinos were paid less than half the wages of the American worker. So, from the American perspective, this agricultural work did not pay enough. But imagine from the Filipino perspective, they're being paid less than half of the American worker. And this is in the beginning because they're going to press their claims through strikes and unionization for higher wages eventually. But at first, they were being paid roughly half the wages of the American worker. So indeed, this is a cheap and exploitable labor force from the perspective of agribusiness owners. But from the Filipino perspective, it's a trade-off because in the Philippines, they're poor, they face poverty. And this is like their solution, their remedy to escape poverty was to sign that contract, to venture over to the U.S. West and become a contract worker. From their perspective, the wages they were receiving for this hard work was a windfall. It was a significant amount from their perspective as poor Filipinos in the Philippines. So it's a trade-off. Now, another feature of their labor was that it was radically migratory. Okay, so unlike European immigrants coming over at that time, where typically they arrive at the East Coast and they settle in ethnic neighborhoods and they work in the factory, and of course the factory is stationary. Compare that to agricultural work where you traverse the entire West Coast wherever you're needed, based on the types of jobs available. For example, they might be sent to Washington State, Yakima Valley, for example, and they pick maybe asparagus there. Then they're next needed to work in, let's say, San Joaquin Valley for a few weeks, and they pick grapes there perhaps. Then they go down to Coachella Valley, all the way down to Southern California, and they pick whatever crops are around there. So they never really have these definitive ethnic neighborhoods. So if you don't see a critical mass of Filipino immigrants settling in one place, and perhaps, more and more immigrants coming over, so it enlarges, and therefore you don't see encroachment into, let's say, white neighborhoods or what have you, how could this emergence of anti-Filipino sentiment happen? If they're radically migratory and just traversing, again, the West Coast, here today, gone tomorrow, how could that arouse anti-Filipino sentiment? First of all, let's think about them as colonial subjects, right? Aren't Filipinos part of America? Well, sort of, right? They're a colony. Aren't they assimilated in Western education and Western culture due to colonialism in their homeland? Yes. Do they speak fluent English due to their English classes taught by American school teachers? Sure. They might have an accent, but they speak English quite well. So what could give rise, again, to this anti-Filipino sentiment? Well, there's going to be various accusations cast towards Filipinos, that they're stealing jobs, that they're carriers of exotic diseases, that they're dirty. This notion of the inherent criminality of Filipinos. Okay, so all this collection of accusations will be hurled towards them, but really at bottom was an explosive charge that they are violators of anti-miscegenation laws. So let's examine these charges and these accusations cast toward the Filipinos. Okay, were they stealing jobs? Well, despite the nativist complaints of labor competition, whites didn't comprise the bulk of the agribusiness force. As I just mentioned, most Americans did not want to work in agricultural labor because of how grueling it was, and certainly the conditions and the climate and everything. Not to mention, it demanded that person to be migratory, radically migratory, and not settled in one place, as you see in industrial work in a single factory. So really, when you think about it, the Mexicans were the only competition for Filipinos because, Mexicans were there too, working in agribusiness. Just like today, you see a lot of Mexicans working in agribusiness. In fact, white agribusiness owners used to complain about Americans, that they moved too slow, that they couldn't pack properly, and they felt that the Americans tended to think of the job as beneath the typical American, right? Here's a quote, in fact, from one farm business owner, quote, "You can't tell a white boy anything. You can't supervise them," quote unquote. Okay, so there you go. They just preferred to go with other races because coming from another country, they're more willing to do the job and, accept the low wage at the same time. And they did not feel that it was beneath them because of their impoverished backgrounds. Okay, now, were they carriers of exotic diseases? No, not true. This is, again, this old belief that racial groups are biologically disposed to exotic disease. Back then, there was this belief, and again, it wasn't backed by science. It's almost like this superstition or what have you, that persons of different skin color tended to be the carriers of disease. Not the virus, right, but skin color. That's not true, of course. Now, another thing was that were they, westernized? Of course they were. They were Christian. They spoke English, as I mentioned, pretty much assimilated almost fully to Western culture. So really the main reason, as I alluded to earlier, is tied to the willingness of Filipinos to date white women, and perhaps equally as infuriating to nativists, the willingness of some white women to date Filipino men and, in fact, to marry them. Now, one important thing here is this concept called anti-miscegenation. Okay, first of all, let's just talk about miscegenation. Here's a term you don't see around anymore, okay, because it's much less controversial. What does a miscegenation refer to? That refers to interracial relationships, right? Sexual relations between the races and even marriages, right? So anti-miscegenation, of course, is the view that this should not happen. And indeed, the United States had various anti-miscegenation laws. Now, they weren't federal laws across all, states around at that time, but they were state laws. So various states had versions of anti-miscegenation laws, whereby people from different races were prohibited from having relationships with each other, romantic sexual relationships, let alone marriage. Now, not all states carried these. In fact, some of these Filipinos would go to states with their white fiancé that didn't have anti-miscegenation laws and then get married there. And then they would venture back to California to work, and they had to deal with the consequences there. But nonetheless, they existed, okay, anti-miscegenation laws. So when you think about it, arguably the main reason, the root cause of anti-Filipino sentiment flaring by the 1930s is tied to their willingness to date white women amid anti-miscegenation practices and anti-miscegenation laws. And indeed, what became caricatured with the Filipinos was this notion of Filipino sexual aggression, their primitiveness. Okay. By the way, this is sort of thinking of African Americans during Jim Crow, in the segregated South. The same type of caricature arose with African American males. So Filipino men, they did openly pursue white women, most of them, right? They did date, and some even sought marriage with white women. And as I mentioned, many white women agreed to it. Now, it makes you think, why would Filipinos think this way when perhaps they learn about anti-miscegenation laws upon arriving? Why would they still continue to pursue this? Well, you got to think about that colonial experience that they had in the Philippines. There's a connection between their colonial education they received in the Philippines and their mindset as, colonial workers migrating to the mother country of America, right? So because of their white school teachers teaching them about equality and freedom, they made this false assumption that we are equal to everyone there. And therefore, this sense of equality led to the conclusion that, hey, we could date white women. And when they learn that it's even, against the law, they'll say, hey, this is unjust, right? This is not what America espouses. This is not the America in their textbooks. So many of them, in fact, were willing to fight against this injustice, as we'll soon discuss. By the way, not only refers to, or this tendency to fight injustice among Filipinos, not only refers to fighting anti-miscegenation laws, but also to fighting their exploitation as agribusiness laborers. You might know this, but most Americans don't know this, but that Filipinos were at the forefront of the 1960s movement to end exploitation of farm workers. In fact, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta and the Mexican workers joined their union, right, that was already established to fight against labor exploitation in the 60s and 70s.